quantity which was speedily thus about to be raised. The mining euphoria, which took off in 1824, coincided with a period of domestic prosperity in Britain. The trade and manufactures of the country, reflected Tooke, had never been in a more regular, sound, and satisfactory state than in the interval from 1821 to 1824. The national sense of well-being was so great, according to the Annual Register, that even the country gentleman, the most querulous of all classes, could no longer complain. Speculation flared up in the commodity markets. First, the price of cotton and silk rose, which encouraged outsiders to enter the market. Then other commodities, including indigo, rice, gum, nutmegs, coffee, and pepper, followed suit. By the end of the year, according to Tooke, the example of early successful speculation had become infectious. Demand for commodities was rising because the inventories of manufacturers and merchants had remained low after the severe post-war depression of 1817, and now needed replenishing as prosperity returned. In particular, the anticipation of exports to the liberated countries provoked fears of raw material shortages. This emerging market story revived an old dream that went back to the establishment of the South Sea Company in 1711, when exporters had prepared a variety of articles, ranging from silk handkerchiefs to Cheshire cheeses, for export to South America. In 1824, British goods were sent out to South America in such quantities that they outstripped both local demand and warehousing facilities, and were left to rot on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro. "It is positively declared," wrote Harriet Martineau, "that warming pans from Birmingham were among the articles exposed under the burning sun of that sky, and that skates from Sheffield were offered for sale to a people who had never heard of ice. Stranger still was the dispatch to Buenos Aires of British dairymaids to milk the cows of the River Plate and supply butter to the city. This venture proved fruitless after it was discovered that locals preferred oil in their cooking, and the butter soon turned rancid in the fierce tropical climate." On New Year's Eve of 1825, the Foreign Secretary George Canning, in response to the invasion of Spain by a French army, unexpectedly announced the official British recognition of South American independence. In Canning's famous phrase, he called the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old. The effect of this declaration on the South American mining market was electrifying. The Anglo-Mexican shares, on which £10 had been paid, rose from 33 in December to over 150 a month later. Shares in the Real del Monte, a Mexican mine that had first produced silver in 1525, climbed from £550 to £1,350. As only £70 had been paid on these shares, speculators who had bought them at their issue were sitting on a paper profit of more than 2,000%. The excitement in the stock market was too much for one young man, who, reversing his previously negative stance on mining shares, turned bullish. Benjamin Disraeli, still only a teenager in 1824, combined youthful impetuosity with a deep and restless ambition. Born the son of a distinguished literary critic of Jewish birth, his grandfather had been one of the select group of Jew brokers, the young Disraeli was profoundly conscious that lack of riches excluded him from influence. He had been placed by his father in a solicitor's office in Gray's Inn, but the prospect of a legal career appalled him. "To succeed as an advocate," he wrote, "I must be a great lawyer, and to be a great lawyer I must give up my chance of being a great man." Financial speculation offered a speedier and less demoralizing route to wealth and power. "It immediately struck me," he wrote, recalling the fervid atmosphere of late 1824, "that if fortunes were ever to be made, this was the moment, and I accordingly paid great attention to American affairs." Disraeli was commissioned by J.D. Powles, the mining company promoter, to write in support of the South American mining companies. He set about the task with great gusto, and soon produced a 100-page pamphlet in which he reiterated the familiar arguments of the mining bull. South America was on the verge of a great increase in wealth. gold extracted from the mines would revive the South American continent, and Britain, with its investments and manufactured exports, would be the main beneficiary of this economic revolution. Although Disraeli falsely portrayed himself in the pamphlet as one whose opinions are unbiased by self-interest and uncontrolled by party influence, he did at least follow his own advice. Financed with a loan of over £2,000 from Robert Messer, the son of a wealthy stockbroker, Disraeli began buying mining shares in November 1824. His speculations continued into the following year. On April Fool's Day 1825, he wrote to his publisher and fellow speculator John Murray that an immense and permanent rise is to be looked to in the mining market. The same month he boasted to Messer, "All the information which is now received from America passes through my hands. I have perused secret reports which have not even been seen by many of the directors themselves. I have read every book upon the subject and conversed with some secret agents of the companies in which I am interested, and I have come to the conviction that the £100 shares in the Mexican mining companies will, in a very few years, be worth upwards of £1,000 apiece." Exhausted by speculation and pamphlet writing, his head spinning with ambition, he told Messer, "I feel actually dizzy. It is truly work for life. On the Mexican mines I rest my sheet anchor." Dizzy indeed. Domestic ventures. For those unable or unwilling to gamble on the South American mines, new domestic joint stock companies appeared of a number not seen since the days of the South Sea. In March 1824, Nathan Rothschild founded the Alliance Fire and Insurance Company, allegedly after his cousin had been refused a position at an established company because of his faith. Following the successful flotation of the alliance, which later prospered, less substantial companies were floated, several of which appealed to contemporary urban fashions. The Metropolitan Bath Company was established to pipe seawater from the coast to London, offering the benefits of seawater bathing to those who could not afford the expense of the resorts. Another venture, the London Umbrella Company, promised to free the public from the inconvenience of carrying an umbrella when the weather was fine, and of being without one when it is wet, by establishing a number of stations in the City and West End from which umbrellas could be rented for a small charge. Several of the new companies purported a philanthropic concern for their future customers. The Metropolitan Fish Company promised to supply fish at low cost to the poor of the capital, who until then could only afford to feed on sprats and herrings. The London Pawnbroking Company claimed it would assist the poor by undercutting usurious pawnbrokers and employ capital profitably without the slightest risk of loss. The London Cemetery Association for the Security of the Dead was established to end the activities of body snatchers and assure perfect security for the repose of the dead, effectively remedying various other evils long complained of and yielding a very handsome return for the investment. Profits were to be derived from burial fees and the sale of vaults, which, considering the number of deaths, will almost exceed the powers of calculation. As in 1720, humorous fable pursued investor credulity. A prospectus was circulated on the Stock Exchange to raise money for a company to drain the Red Sea in search of the gold and jewels left by the Egyptians in their passage after the Israelites. A newspaper reported that the high price of iron had induced several merchants and bankers to form the Resurrection Metal Company, to raise tons of cannonballs that lay on the sea bed near Trafalgar and other scenes of British naval victories. The government, reported the paper, had no claims on the balls, for by canon law the act of firing guns under proper authority was an authorized surrender of all property in the balls on the part of the Crown. The South American mines were to be rendered profitable by the application of British technology. Writing in early 1825, an anonymous pamphleteer observed, "A vague, indefinite, and feverish expectation of magnificent results to be produced by the advance of science and the acuteness of modern research. In England the railways made their first appearance. "Nothing now is heard of but railroads," complained one journal. "The daily papers teem with notices of new lines of them in every direction, and pamphlets and paragraphs are thrown before the public eye, recommending nothing short of making them general throughout the kingdom." In Parliament, the President of the Board of Trade, William Huskisson, argued in favour of the bill for the London and Birmingham. At the opening of the line 5 years later, Huskisson became the first railway fatality when he was run over by George Stephenson's locomotive, the Rocket. As in earlier speculative periods, most companies were established for no purpose other than to benefit their promoters. "All we have to do," claimed the fictional promoter in a contemporary novel, "is to puff up shares to a premium, humbug the public into buying them, and then let the whole concern go to ruin." A variety of means were employed to advance this humbug. Only a small deposit was required on new issues. Rumours of speculators' fortunes were circulated in order to entice new players into the market. Brokers were employed to manipulate share prices, and journalists were paid to puff companies in the money market columns that had recently appeared in the papers. The editor of the Morning Chronicle accused his fellow editors of undermining their journalistic integrity by taking shares in many of the new schemes. Editorial indifference to the exposure of fraud was also influenced by a court case involving the Chronicle itself, which had concluded with the trial judge opining that the conductors of newspapers had no recognized vocation to enlighten the public with regard to abuses. Parliament and the Mania. The most common practice of projectors seeking to promote their companies was to employ members of Parliament and peers as guinea pig or decoy directors. In the first Directory of Directors, published by the Times in February 1825, the names of nearly 30 MPs appeared. Members of Parliament proliferated on the boards of the South American mining companies. 2 earls and 1 member of Parliament sat on the board of the Colombian Pearl Fishery Association, which was established to dive for oysters in the Pacific. The Duke of Wellington, who privately expressed fears about the mania, nevertheless sat with the Duke of York on the board of the American Colonial Steam Navigation Company. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, together with 3 members of his cabinet, accepted directorships in an ill-fated scheme that proposed to invest £1 million for the cultivation of mulberry trees and the propagation of the silkworm in Great Britain and Ireland. The MPs and peers who sold their names to flaky enterprises did not escape public censure. The Times complained of the leprous infection of avarice, which led them to become directors. Later, Harriet Martineau blamed the speculative mania on the decline of the character of the House of Commons, too many of whose members acted, in regard to these bills for joint stock companies, with a recklessness which subjected them to a suspicion that they, like others, had forgotten themselves, and had sacrificed their legislative conscience to the interests of themselves and their friends. Parliament, so far from acting as a counterweight to the excesses of speculation, appeared to be actively stimulating it. After 105 years, the lesson of the South Sea year had been forgotten. Gross complacency, even contemptuous arrogance, was evident among the ruling classes. At the opening of Parliament in early February 1825, politicians basked in the economic prosperity of the nation. The King's speech, delivered by the Lord Chancellor, boasted, "There was never a period in the history of this country when all the great interests of the nation were at the same time in so thriving a condition, or when a feeling of content and satisfaction was more widely diffused through all the classes of the British people." In his budget speech, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Frederick Prosperity Robinson, congratulated the House on the circumstances of the period. "We may safely venture to contemplate with instructive admiration the harmony of its proportion and the solidity of its basis." Despite these declamations, some members of Parliament expressed a concern that speculation had gone too far. In the middle of March, John Cam Hobhouse, Byron's former travelling companion, complaint to the Commons that projectors were manipulating stock prices, and evidently proceeded upon the supposition that there was an infinite fund of gullibility in the dupes to whom they addressed themselves. Alexander Baring, a member of the banking family, announced that he saw no difference between the gambling of the nobleman in the halls of St. James's Street and the gambling of the merchant on the Royal Exchange, except that the latter kept earlier hours and more respectable company than the former. Baring told the Commons that he believed that all the mining speculations would turn out to be delusions, and that many innocent persons would lose thereby. The great error of the mining speculations, in his view, was the belief that the mines could be exploited more efficiently with British capital, labour, and technology. A few days later, Lord Liverpool rose in the House of Lords to issue a stern warning to speculators. He could, he said, accept that in a commercial country a great deal of speculation was unavoidable, and this spirit of speculation, if kept within certain limits, was attended with much advantage. He understood also that in a time of peace, when interest rates were low, speculation would be prevalent. He wished it, however, to be clearly understood that those who now engaged in joint stock companies or other enterprises entered on those speculations at their peril and risk. He thought it his duty to declare that he never would advise the introduction of any bill for their relief. On the contrary, if such a measure were proposed, he would oppose it, and he hoped that Parliament would resist any measure of the kind. Behind this admonition lurked an uncertainty on the part of government as to how to deal with the phenomenon of over-speculation. The Cabinet was strongly, if not dogmatically, influenced by the emergent free trade movement, and free trade was linked inextricably with the free movement of capital, which was seen both as a civil right and as the begetter of Britain's manufacturing and trading supremacy. As Lord Liverpool acknowledged, speculation was inevitable in a modern commercial society, and an attempt to control it would restrain the invisible hand that directed economic affairs with an almost divine omniscience. The government also recognized that joint stock companies had an increasingly important role to play in providing funds for capital-intensive businesses, such as banks, insurance companies, canals, railways, gasworks, and waterworks. Yet there was an acute awareness of speculation as an evil, both corrupting and, in its etymological sense, overbearing and excessive. Speculation threatened to induce a general crisis in which the innocent would suffer along with the guilty. Initially, the government promised new legislation to halt speculation, and even threatened prosecutions under the old Bubble Act of 1720. Disraeli was hastily commissioned to write a pamphlet against the threatened regulation. "We fear," he wrote with characteristic flippancy and a great deal of truth, "that the folly of man is not subject material for legislation." The government eventually reached the same conclusion. In the middle of March, Huskisson told the House of Commons that there would be no legislation. He was sure that the high-raised hopes of many who embarked in such speculations would in the end vanish into thin air, and leave those who entertained them nothing but regret and disappointment. At the same time, he did not see how the Parliament could at present interfere. In June, the Bubble Act of 1720, for many years a dead letter, was finally repealed. The government failed to find a balance between its economically liberal instincts and its moral repugnance to speculation. The speculative mania raised important questions that it was unable to answer. What was the difference between over-speculation and legitimate commerce? How could the former be controlled without hindering the latter? The dilemma was expressed succinctly by Alexander Baring. The evil of speculation was certainly one which deserved to be checked, though he hardly knew how the check could be applied. The remedy would be worse than the disease, if, in putting a stop to this evil, they put a stop to the spirit of enterprise. That spirit was productive of so much benefit to the community that he should be sorry to see any person drawing a line discriminating between fair enterprise and extravagant speculation. There was to be no legislative remedy. Instead, the evil was left to produce its own cure. A torrent of distrust. In January 1825, nearly 70 companies, including 5 railways, were floated. Speculation in commodities, loans and shares continued strongly for several months, but in the spring the euphoria began to wane. South American bond prices went into decline and continued falling throughout the summer. In late August, a small loan for the United Provinces of Central America was floated, but it failed to attract any support and its scrip fell to an immediate discount. In the same month, Brazilian scrip also dropped despite an announcement of continuing interest payments. Investors had tired of receiving their dividends out of capital. As a summer torpor set in, trading on the stock market was thin. Investors began ignoring calls on partly paid shares, which led several companies to petition for dissolution. The leading stock of the mining mania, the Real del Monte, fell from a high of 1,550 to under 200. A crisis beckoned. During the mania, banks had recklessly extended credit, discounting bills for merchants who were speculating in commodities and lending against the inflated collateral of bonds and shares. In late August, the Bank of England became alarmed by the decline of its gold reserves. It had over £19 million of banknotes in circulation, but less than £4 million in gold specie with which to support this paper credit. In order to avoid its potential failure, the bank rapidly contracted its operations, and even refused to discount, provide credit against, the notes of Barings and Rothschilds. Against the strong opposition of William Huskisson, the bank continued building up its hoard of bullion throughout the autumn. The tightening of credit by the Bank of England had a knock-on effect throughout the financial system. Worst affected were the country banks. These institutions were unregulated and unprofessional. As Lord Liverpool remarked, any petty tradesman, any grocer or cheesemonger, however destitute of property, might set up a bank in any place. Although Britain had officially returned to the gold standard in 1819, the country banks had been permitted to issue paper notes, unbacked by specie, until 1832. During the boom, they had stimulated the asset inflation by doubling their issues of paper currency, lending to stock market speculators, and discounting notes for long periods. When confidence evaporated and credit dried up, their weaknesses were exposed. Across the nation, local panics or runs afflicted the country banks. In early October there were 2 failures in the West Country, followed soon after by the collapse of the Plymouth Bank. As the crisis deepened, the Morning Chronicle warned that the Bank of England has to choose between its own insolvency and the insolvency of these imprudent speculations, and as it is impossible, in the present state of things, for the bank, with any regard for its own safety, to stretch out a friendly hand to them, the consequences may easily be foreseen. In other words, the Bank of England was not in the position to act as lender of the last resort. By December, the city was in a state of commotion. Early that month, a run appeared on the London Bank of Poland Company. The Bank of England agreed to an emergency loan to stave off its collapse, but the failure of Wentworth and Company, a leading Yorkshire bank, heightened the tension. On the 14th of December, Poles stopped payment, dragging down over 40 of its correspondent country banks. On the same day, city merchants gathered at the Mansion House in an attempt to boost public confidence, declaring that they had the firmest confidence in the stability of the public credit of the country. The private opinion of a Bank of England director was more frank. "Never were such times. If this state of things continues, we must ask not who is gone, but who stands. For unless something is done to relieve the pressure and to restore confidence, few can resist so overwhelming a torrent of distrust." On the stock market, share prices fell by up to 80%, while some stocks went unquoted. Troops were called to Threadneedle Street after a mob gathered at the doors of a faltering Bank of England, whose gold reserves had dwindled to under £1 million. In the midst of unprecedented prosperity, economic activity ground to a halt. Although the shops were overflowing with goods and food was abundant, credit had taken flight. Only gold remained acceptable, and in spite of the South American fables, there was not enough of it to go round. The country, Huskisson remarked, was only 48 hours away from barter. All confidence was lost, Alexander Baring later told the Commons. Scarcely one man could be found to trust his neighbour, every one endeavouring to husband his own resources for himself. Such a state of panic had hardly ever before existed amongst us. It was imperative that the Bank of England resume its discounting operations. In emergency session, the Cabinet decided to permit the Bank of England to circulate notes of small denomination. It was previously forbidden from issuing notes with a value of less than £5. A box of unissued £1 notes was discovered in the bank's vaults and hastily distributed. The Mint was set to work coining sovereigns at the rate of 150,000 a day. Nathan Rothschild brought over from France 300,000 gold sovereigns, which he paid into the bank. These emergency measures saved the day. By Christmas Eve, despite the failure of around 70 banks, the Bank of England was no longer threatened with failure and was able to resume discounting the bills of the more creditworthy banks and merchants. The stock market panic was over, but the period of economic crisis was just beginning. Among the casualties of the crisis was Sir Walter Scott, whose publisher, Constable, and manager, James Ballantyne, were brought down by the failure of their London bank, which had engaged in commodities speculation. Linked by partnership, Scott became legally responsible for £46,000 worth of Ballantyne's debts. At the age of 55, the author decided to face his creditors. "I will be their vassal for life, and dig into the mine of my imagination to find diamonds, to make good my engagements, not to enrich myself." This mine provided richer lodes than those in South America, and Scott eventually discharged his debts. In February 1826, the banking firm of B.A. Goldschmidt and Company, which a few years earlier had earned over £250,000 contracting a Mexican loan, failed. Its principal partner, L.A. Goldschmidt, died shortly afterwards of a broken blood vessel in his head, induced by anxiety. The same month, the London merchants requested an issue of exchequer notes to be provided against the collateral of their inventories, as had occurred during the financial crisis of 1793. Lord Liverpool, however, remained deaf to these pleas, and reminded Parliament of his earlier warnings to speculators. He invoked the principle of moral hazard, which dictates that the rash and foolhardy should suffer, since any relief would only stimulate the revival of speculation, and provoke another crisis in the future. As Huskisson explained in the Commons, if parties might always expect to obtain asylum in government, it was as much calculated to encourage speculation as the Poor Laws were to encourage vagrancy and to discourage honest industry. Suffering for the evil of speculation was deemed purgative. The inordinate appetite for gain, if left to itself, could not fail to work its own cure through its own certain disappointment, declared Canning, the Foreign Secretary. It is most unfair, he added defensively, to infer from any hesitation on the part of the government to adopt any particular remedy under such circumstances, that there exists, therefore, on their part, an insensibility to the extent or nature of the existing evil. Unfortunately, the existing evil, as Canning so delicately called the economic crisis, was not visited upon sinful speculators alone. Throughout the greater part of 1826, the country remained in severe depression. Bankruptcies for the first half of the year tripled. Manufacturers curtailed their output, and worker unrest fanned out across the country. In Norwich, weavers rioted throughout the early part of the year. The unemployment situation became so bad that a colonial secretary suggested an inquiry into the expediency of encouraging emigration from the United Kingdom. He was supported by a group of unemployed Scottish weavers who entreated the government to cast them into exile. South American blues. Towards the end of 1826, The Morning Chronicle reported the death of a ham merchant of St. Nicholas Lane, who had destroyed himself in a fit of temporary derangement caused by the depreciation in value of some Spanish bonds. Earlier in the summer, the market value of South American loans, issued with a face value of £25 million, had declined to less than £12 million. These bonds had initially paid dividends from reserves set aside at the time of their issue, but these reserves had run out, and every South American state defaulted on its debt, with the sole exception of Brazil. It was not only the bondholders who lost out, the South American people also suffered. The small sums which had actually been remitted to the states by the loan contractors were expended on military equipment for war against neighbouring states, or used to suppress internal opposition to the regimes. The loan mania also created what has aptly been called the first Latin American debt crisis. Interest due on the loans became an obstacle to trade between Britain and South America, and for over half a century the loans went through a tortuous process of rescheduling and default. As for shares, wrote the Morning Chronicle's money market columnist in February 1826, no person thinks of mentioning their names, and thousands wish they had never had a name to mention. Over 100 companies floated during the mania were abandoned during the course of the year. The Monthly Review dismissed them as a great shoal of monstrous abortions, begotten by fraud upon credulity. The Real del Monte, on which £400 had been paid, sunk to 115, and the Bolivar Mining Association, organized to extract copper from the Liberator's Venezuelan family property, fell from 28 to 1. The crash of the mining market shattered Disraeli's youthful dreams. Saddled with debts of several £1,000s, which were not finally discharged for a quarter of a century, the future Prime Minister now turned his abundant energy to writing fiction, and drew on his personal experience to produce his first novel, Vivian Grey. Exhausted by events, he subsequently suffered a nervous breakdown and was sent abroad to recover. The collapse of the mining stocks was largely the result of an account of the South American mines published in early 1826 by Captain F. B. Head, chief engineer of the Rio Plata Mining Association. Head had travelled more than 3,000 miles across the South American continent, earning himself the nickname Galloping Head. His company's prospectors had claimed that gold was so abundant in its concessionary area that it need only be washed from the mud. The reality, according to Head, was rather different. The company's mining concessions were either disputed or worked bare by slave labour, which British miners could not emulate. In extremely inhospitable mining conditions, British technology turned out to be useless, nor was the Spanish legacy so easily dispensed with. Captain Head found the South American people to be perfectly destitute of the idea of a contract, of punctuality, or of the value of time. The universal failure of the mining companies, wrote Head, proceeded from one cause, our ignorance of the country which was to be the field of speculation. The same was true of the South American loans, most especially of the Poyet loan. Creditors displayed a total ignorance of the incapacity of the disorganized, unstable, and poverty-stricken Latin American countries to service their loans. The lack of knowledge about the mining companies was so general that it was said the less known of the place where a mine was to be sunk, the higher the premium its shares reached. Instead of acting on sound information, speculators were driven by fantasy. Since the time of Drake's circumnavigation and his return in 1580 with Spanish booty, South America had retained a special allure for the English people. Yet they were not solely motivated by greed. Their investment had a romantic and political aspect to it. They were purchasing the freedom of a continent that in English eyes had suffered long enough from Spanish exploitation, intolerance, and backwardness. The mining speculators were doing something far grander than simply engaging in seedy operations for personal gain. They were, in Disraeli's words, patronizing infant liberty and liberal principles. In short, The South American mania represented the triumph of a soaring imagination over rational financial calculation. As Harriet Martineau later recalled, the charm was in the excitement, in the pleasure of sympathy in large enterprises, in the rousing of the faculties of imagination and conception when their field of commerce extended over the Pampas and Andes, and beyond the farthest seas, and among the ice rocks of the poles. When the grey-haired merchant grew eloquent by his fireside about the clefts of the Cordillera, where the precious metals glitter to the miner's torch, it was not his expected gains alone that fired the eye and quickened his utterance, but that gratification of his conceptive faculty to which his ordinary life had ministered too little. The events of 1822–25 were only the first in a long succession of emerging market booms. For much of the 19th century, the United States was an emerging market for British investors, who poured capital into state bonds and railroad companies, and experienced frequent losses. Towards the end of the century, South America attracted a fresh bout of speculation, which ended with the collapse of Alexander Baring's family bank after it was left holding a pile of Argentine utility bonds. The U.S. bull market of the 1920s, like the British boom a century earlier, was preceded by a spate of speculative lending to South American countries, all of which defaulted in the Depression years. The contraction of American foreign lending in the early 1930s served to deepen the international depression. More recently, the American bull market of the 1990s has been accompanied by speculative loans and investments in the emerging markets of South America, the Far East, and the countries of the former Soviet Union. The motivation behind these foreign investments has been similar to that which inspired British investors in the 1820s. Whereas British goods, capital and skills were to modernize the South American states after their liberation from the dead hand of the Spaniard, in the 1990s it was to be American goods and capital that replaced the sclerosis of state socialism. In their euphoria, modern investors in emerging markets ignored the profound differences between their own political and economic cultures and those of the countries in which they invested, just as their British predecessors had done in the 1820s. The 1990s has witnessed an unprecedented number of stock market bubbles in far-flung places, from Chile to Bangladesh. According to one investment strategist, the challenge to investors in emerging markets is to time the surfing of the bubble correctly, stay in long enough to benefit, but get out before the bubble bursts. Investors sought a high return on their foreign stock investments and loans, but took fright at the first signs of distress. Fears of a domino effect, as speculators fleeing one country destroy confidence in its neighbours, have produced a new era of international instability with competitive currency devaluations reminiscent of the 1930s. As a bear market developed in emerging market debt in the middle of 1998, the fallout looked depressingly similar to earlier periods. The stock markets of the submerging markets, as they were quickly renamed, have fared equally miserably, sinking back to their levels at the beginning of the decade. Just as in the 1820s, the effect of this speculative boom will most likely be to sour relations between the developing nations and the West, and to discredit the free market model in the eyes of those who have seen piles of money thrust through their front door, only to witness it leaving twice as speedily out the back door. The trade and speculative cycles. Emerging market speculation tends to appear at a juncture in the economic cycle when declining yields on domestic bonds combine with an excess of capital to make foreign investments particularly attractive. The mania of 1822–25 marks the beginning of a close connection between speculation and the business cycle. Sir William Petty had first observed the trade cycle, which he described as successions of dearth and plenty, back in the 17th century. Originally, this cycle was associated with crises brought on by poor harvests, war, and problems of public finance, rather than speculative excess. For instance, The original Black Friday of the 6th of December 1745 was caused by the Jacobite invasion and the Young Pretender's progress to Derby. As the economy became more advanced in the second half of the 18th century, the agricultural and fiscal nature of the economic cycle gave way to a new cycle based upon the expansion and contraction of credit. Within the last 60 years, wrote Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his Lay Sermon of 1817, there have occurred at intervals of about 12 or 13 years each certain periodical revolutions of credit. For a short time this Icarian credit, or rather this illegitimate offspring of confidence, seems to lie stunned by the fall. Alarm and suspicion gradually diminish into a judicious circumspectness, but little by little circumspection gives way to the desire and emulous ambition of doing business, till impatience and incaution on the one side, tempting and encouraging headlong adventure, want of principle, and confederacies of false credit on the other, the movements of trade become yearly gayer and giddier, and end at length in a vortex of hopes and hazards, of blinding passions and blind practices. These thoughts were articulated in the midst of the severe depression that followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Within a few years, credit and confidence had revived, and the economic cycle developed along the lines predicted by Coleridge, until it erupted in a full-blown speculative mania. The boom of 1822–25 can be understood as the product of easy credit conditions. The bonds of the South American states were attractive to British investors because the supply of consols was drying up, and their yield was shrinking. The country banks contributed to the boom by deluging the nation with paper notes. This fictitious surplus, according to Alexander Baring, was the fuel by which the fire was fed. During the boom, the unrestricted growth of credit caused asset prices to rise, stimulating yet further credit creation. The situation reached a turning point in the spring of 1825, after which declining asset prices undermined confidence, caused a contraction of credit, and eventually brought on a crisis. After the crisis of 1825, the banker and bullionist S.J. Lloyd, later Lord Overston, described a cycle very much like Coleridge's. First, we find it in a state of quiescence. Next, improvement, growing confidence, prosperity, excitement, overtrading, convulsions, pressure, stagnation, distress, ending again in quiescence. In Overston's description, the cycles of trade, credit, and speculation are all connected. During the mania of 1822–25, speculation in stocks, bonds, and commodities was matched by a keen anticipation of exports to South America and hazardous lending by banks against the collateral of stocks and shares. Overston's psychological interpretation of the economic cycle was taken up and elaborated by Walter Bagehot, the editor of The Economist. Bagehot explained hazardous speculation as the result of an excess of accumulation over tested investment, which recurred in periods of prosperity. The fact is that the owners of savings, not finding in adequate quantities their usual kind of investments, rush into anything that promises speciously, and when they find that these specious investments can be disposed of at a high profit, they rush into them more and more. The first taste is for high interest, but that taste soon becomes secondary. There is a second appetite for large gains to be made by selling the principal which is to yield the interest. So long as such sales can be effected, the mania continues. When it ceases to be possible to effect them, ruin begins. During the upturn of the cycle, Bagehot argued, people become convinced the prosperity will last forever, and mercantile houses engage in excessive speculations. At the same time, an increasing number of frauds are perpetrated on investors, which only come to light after a crisis. All people are most credulous when they are most happy. After 1825, there was a succession of booms and crises at roughly 10-year intervals. At the end of the 19th century, they were analysed by the French economist Clément Juglar, who gave his name to the decennial Juglar cycle. The 10-year cycle was related by 19th century economists to various factors, such as the expansion and contraction of credit, the rise and fall of manufacturers' inventories, and even the periodic appearance of sunspots. According to John Stuart Mill, the seeds of each boom are sown during the preceding crisis, when the liquidation of credit causes asset prices to decline so severely that they become genuine bargains. Their subsequent sharp rise from a low level leads to a revival of speculation. After each crisis, the financial markets invariably shrug off past follies and losses to confront the future with bright optimism and fresh credulity. Capital becomes blind, to use Bagehot's term. Unable to remember the past, investors are condemned to repeat it. Chapter 5. A Ready Communication, the Railway Mania of 1845. Men have an indistinct notion that if they keep up this activity of joint stocks and spades long enough, all will at length ride somewhere in next to no time and for nothing. But though a crowd rushes to the depot and the conductor shouts, "All aboard!" when the smoke is blown away and the vapour condensed, it will be perceived that a few are riding, but the rest are run over, and it will be called, and will be, a melancholy accident. Henry David Thoreau, Walden, 1854. Innovation, wrote Joseph Schumpeter, is the outstanding fact in the economic history of capitalist society. Speculators are in the vanguard of the capitalist process. Once an innovation has been successfully established and produces steady returns, speculation gives way to investment, which is more concerned with safety of principal and regularity of income than with capital gains. Unlike the speculator, the investor is primarily interested in the current state of affairs. Insofar as he anticipates the future at all, he hopes that it will be a seamless continuation of the present. Inventions and novelties have always excited speculators. The diving machine, fire engine, and burglar alarm companies in the 1690s, and the machine gun and wheel for perpetual motion in 1720, are early examples of speculators' enthusiasm for technological advances. Until the Industrial Revolution, however, the innovations which attracted the attention of speculators were either of limited application or mere frauds thrown up during boom times. From the late 18th century, however, there have occurred a number of genuine innovations in the field of communications which have had very far-reaching effects on society. First came the canals, followed in succession by railways, motor cars, radio, aircraft, computers, and most recently the Internet. Each of these advances in communications attracted the fervent attention of speculators, who contributed greatly to their successful establishment. The Canal Mania. The canal age in Britain commenced with the completion in 1767 of the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal, which ran some 30 miles from the coal mines on the Duke's estate at Worsley, north of Manchester, to Runcorn in the southwest, where the new textile factories were situated. Over the following 2 decades, more than 1,000 miles of canals were constructed. The first canals produced tremendous returns on capital, paid large dividends, and enjoyed soaring share prices. They also generated great popular excitement, as the benefits they provided, in the form of cheaper transport costs for coal, manufactures, and agricultural produce, appeared to have the potential of transforming the old world. In the early 1790s, popular speculation in canals appeared for the first time. During this period, over 50 parliamentary acts for new canals were passed, more than double the number of the preceding 50 years. Meetings of subscribers were held in fields, inns, and even churches. Local dealers, often the clerks of canal companies, solicitors, or innkeepers, set up navigation offices, reminiscent of the tulip colleges of the 1630s. Canal speculation reached a climax in the winter of 1792–93. The newspapers in the Midlands, where the majority of schemes were projected, were filled with advertisements for stockbrokers, reports of crowded shareholders' meetings, and spectacular prices for canal stock. The subscribers to the Leicester Navigation Canal adopted as a motto for their company some lines from Horace: Liquidus fortuna rivus inauret. May the liquid stream of fortune cover you with gold. It was wishful thinking. The canal mania came to an abrupt end with the commercial crisis of 1793, brought on by the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars. Canal share prices collapsed. The investment returns of the new canals turned out to be miserable in comparison with their predecessors, which had been built by local landowners and merchants with a clear idea of their advantages. By the turn of the century, the overall return on capital invested in canals had fallen from a pre-mania level of 50% to around 5%. Even a quarter of a century later, 1 in 5 canals was still unable to pay a dividend, and aggregate dividends, as a percentage of capital invested, produced a return similar to those of risk-free government bonds. Although the opening of new canals linking towns and cities, manufacturers and markets aroused local enthusiasm, the technology itself was not new. After all, the Romans had built aqueducts. Canals simply extended the benefits of water transportation to areas which had not previously enjoyed it. The advent of the railways, on the other hand, represented a far more significant change in the life of man. So profound was this change that when the first steam engines appeared in the 1820s, they were greeted with a mixture of skepticism and trepidation. It was anticipated that locomotives would prevent cows from grazing and hens from laying eggs, that their poisonous fumes would kill birds and blacken the fleeces of sheep, and that their speeds of up to 15 miles an hour would blow passengers to atoms. Railways also faced opposition from canal owners, coaching establishments, and landlords who feared for the tranquillity of their estates and the ruin of their fox hunting. When the Great Western Railway was proposed to connect London with the west of England, both the University of Oxford and Eton College initially refused a connection. Despite widespread hostility, the early history of the railways was marked by 2 outbreaks of speculative enthusiasm. The first railway fever appeared in 1825, with the opening of the first steam railway, the Stockton and Darlington. Soon after, 6 railway acts were passed by Parliament. This brief outbreak of railway euphoria was extinguished in the economic crisis at the end of the year. 6 years later, the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway finally established the superiority of locomotive power over fixed steam engines and horse traction, which until then had seemed viable alternatives. The Liverpool and Manchester soon paid a dividend of 10%, and the market value of its shares doubled. Its success sparked a second railway fever, which appeared amidst a general bout of speculation, a cyclical revival after the crisis of 1825, ranging from Spanish bonds to joint stock banks. When the boom progressed to bust in 1837, the crisis extended to the railways. Few new railways were projected over the next 5 years. By the early 1840s, shares in the majority of railway companies sold at a discount to their issue price. With nearly 2,000 miles of track in operation, many believed that the national railway system was already complete. It was around this date, however, that reflection on the profound changes wrought by the railways began to grip the public mind. In the summer of 1842, the young Queen Victoria was persuaded by Prince Albert to make her first railway trip. She is reported to have found the short journey from Slough to Paddington pleasantly free from dust, heat, and crowds. The opposition of landlords diminished as they discovered that land lying adjacent to railway lines tended to rise in value. Throughout the country, journals and pamphlets proclaimed the railways as a revolutionary advance unparalleled in the history of the world. They not only focused on the economic benefits of railway transport, but concerned themselves with its more widespread effects on human civilization. Railway time, it was said, would change forever the pace of human existence. Our very language begins to be affected by it, wrote a contemporary. Men talk of getting up the steam, of railway speed, and reckon distances by hours and minutes. A railway director announced to a meeting of shareholders that nothing, next to religion, is of so much importance as a ready communication. One paper jubilantly declared that the length of our lives, so far as regards the power of acquiring information and disseminating power, will be doubled, and we may be justified in looking for the arrival of a time when the whole world will have become one great family, speaking one language, governed in unity by like laws, and adoring one God. There was no limit to the imagined effects of this revolution. It was even anticipated that the railways would produce a gradual thawing of that reserve for which the people of Great Britain are celebrated. From an investment point of view, it was argued that railway shares would remain safe in midst of panic. The public was gripped by a railway vogue. In Dombey and Son, 1846, Dickens lampooned the contemporary fashion for railway hotels, office houses, lodging houses, boarding houses, railway plans, maps, views, wrappers, bottles, sandwich boxes, and timetables, railway hackney coach and cab stands, railway omnibuses, railway streets and buildings. A rapidly expanding railway press contributed to the development of the popular enthusiasm. In the early 1840s, there were 3 railway journals, led by the authoritative Railway Times, and during the mania year of 1845, new railway papers appeared nearly every week. They included 14 weekly papers, which were issued twice weekly at the height of the fever, 2 daily papers, and both a morning and an evening paper. The Railway King. One man understood best how to direct the public enthusiasm for railways to his own ends. George Hudson, the chairman of the York and North Midland Railway, was an energetic, overweight, and abrasive Yorkshireman. The son of a farmer in the East Riding, he had started his professional life as a linen draper, and risen, thanks to a sizable inheritance from a great-uncle, to become mayor of York. Hudson's interest in railways dated to 1834, when he first met the engineer George Stephenson, the father of the railways. According to legend, Stephenson was persuaded by Hudson to make York the centre for a northeastern system of lines and branches, or, as Hudson put it in his gruff Yorkshire brogue, to make all railways come to York. After the York and North Midland opened in 1842, Hudson set about planning new lines and branches, and purchasing or leasing existing companies. He projected new lines to join York with Edinburgh. Through a series of mergers, or amalgamations as they were called, he extended his railway system to reach Birmingham, Bristol, and eventually London. By 1844, he controlled over 1,000 miles of railway, more than a third of the total track in operation at the time. It was in this year that Hudson acquired the sobriquet of Railway King, allegedly conferred by the Reverend Sidney Smith, the greatest wit of his day. He was also known as the Yorkshire Balloon, owing to his gluttonous appetite and wide girth. Perhaps he was most accurately described by another title, the Railway Napoleon, for Hudson succeeded in linking his own destiny to that of the railway era. Hudson contrived to associate himself with the advance of the railways, and deliberately fanned the public's growing ardour. He carefully stage-managed the open ceremonies of new lines to extract maximum excitement. All railways are yet in their infancy, and day after day, week after week, and month after month, they will go on increasing their resources, he announced at the opening of a new line in early 1841. When he was elected Member of Parliament for Sunderland in August 1845, he arranged for an express train to bring an early edition of the Times from London to Sunderland, announcing his election victory, before the voters themselves knew of it. "See the march of the intellect! See the power of steam!" he shouted at the crowd, as he distributed free copies of the newspaper. A few days later, at a celebratory dinner, Hudson extolled the virtues of fantasy. "Gentlemen, there is something in imagination. I don't say it ought to govern us, but having formed our judgment, let imagination have a little play." Hudson's management of railways was marked by a combination of ostentation, rule-bending, and penny-pinching. Red tape, he announced, was a commodity he had formerly sold by the yard in his shop, but which had no place in his railway empire. As the chairman of several railway companies, he acted in secrecy and kept his fellow directors in the dark. The company's accounts were his own special preserve, and he refused to hold meetings of finance committees. When he joined the board of the Midland in 1842, he immediately changed the company's accounting methods, announcing, "I will have no statistics on my railway." On another occasion, Hudson is said to have declared, "We don't mind principle in matters of business." Although given to personal extravagance and display, Hudson maintained a tight control of costs and charged the highest tariffs on his lines. In November 1840, a fatal accident on the York and North Midland line occurred after Hudson had employed an elderly train driver with defective eyesight in order to save on wages. Similar accidents became frequent on his railways, and Hudson's critics accused him of sacrificing public safety to profitability. But lower costs enabled Hudson to pay higher prices when taking over rival railway companies and distribute greater dividends to his shareholders. Even while still under construction, the York and North Midland Railway, under Hudson's management, had announced an improbably generous dividend of 9%. Large dividends, in turn, purchased the support of shareholders. When Hudson freely admitted that the York and North Midland was paying its dividend out of capital, there was no murmur of disapproval from shareholders. Nor did they object when the share price of companies amalgamated by Hudson rose prior to a takeover announcement, a sure sign of insider trading. In October 1844, he was able to raise £2.5 million from the shareholders of the Midland Railway without telling them his plans. "Well," he boasted, "I have carried my point, I have got my money, and I have not told a soul what I am going to do with it." An atmosphere of elation and ecstasy characterized the shareholders' meetings. The railway was their new religion, and Hudson their messiah. The Railway Act of 1844. During the railway fever of 1836, some had argued that a government survey of the country should be made so the best routes were chosen for development. However, the absence of political agreement combined with the prevailing doctrine of laissez-faire to ensure that the British railway system would develop piecemeal. The process of establishing a railway was uncomplicated. It required only a few local dignitaries to organize themselves into a committee, for them to register the company provisionally, the organizers were known as provisional committee men, raise money from the public by advertising subscriptions for shares, employ an engineer to survey the route, and apply to Parliament for a railway bill. Once a company was provisionally registered, the subscription certificates for its shares, scrip, on which only a tenth of the capital had been paid, the rest would be called later when construction was underway, could be traded in the market. The only check to the process was the examination by Parliament. In the early days of the railways, it was believed that on payment of a certain toll to the proprietor, anyone might run a train on a railway track, and that the railways would produce their own competition. By the early 1840s, however, it had become clear that railways formed natural monopolies. With the further extension of the railway system imminent, 66 applications for railway bills arrived before Parliament in early 1844. There was a need for fresh public direction in a field almost devoid of government regulation. In early 1844, the talk of framing new railway legislation fell to William Ewart Gladstone, the recently appointed President of the Board of Trade. When he consulted the railway interest about regulation, Gladstone encountered differing opinions. George Carr Glynn, the London banker and chairman of the mighty London and Birmingham Railway, foresaw a depreciation in railway property unless measures were taken to systematize railway legislation. George Hudson, on the other hand, argued fiercely against regulation as an undue interference with private property. Hudson got his way. Under pressure from the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, Gladstone was obliged to water down his initial proposals. Although the Railway Act, which became law in the summer of 1844, created a railway department to examine new lines, its recommendations were not binding on Parliament, and it lacked the facilities to investigate the mountain of schemes about to arrive at its door. I do not believe that the precautions taken by the Railway Act will have the effect of impeding or preventing the application of private capital to the railways, asserted the laissez-faire Prime Minister. Fearing this would indeed be the case, in the autumn of 1844 Gladstone raised the deposit on new railway schemes from 5 to 10%, in the hope of deterring the more speculative promotions. Shortly after, he resigned his post at the Board of Trade, citing a conflict between his official position and his family's own railway interests. In private, he anticipated a return of speculation. "I have a feeling," he wrote before his resignation, "that circumstances connected with the state of the commercial world will undoubtedly subject present legislation to a very severe and early trial." The beginning of the mania. By late 1844, the economic situation was benign. Interest rates were at their lowest point in almost a century, and after a series of excellent harvests, corn was cheap and plentiful. Railway construction costs had fallen, and railway revenues were rising rapidly. The three largest railway companies were paying dividends of 10%, 4 times the prevailing rate of interest, and public interest in the railway revolution was growing. Sensing a groundswell of speculative interest, Hudson purchased large quantities of railway iron for his own account in the winter of 1844. His judgment was shrewd. Within 3 months, its price had tripled. In January 1845, 16 new railway schemes were projected. By April, with rail receipts continuing to grow rapidly, over 50 new companies had been registered. Advertisements for railway prospectuses, soliciting subscriptions from the public, flooded the newspapers. The standard notice contained a list of provisional committeemen, a paragraph extolling the benefits of the proposed line, and in most cases the promise of a final dividend of at least 10%. If the subscription was successful, the committeemen retained a large allocation of stock for themselves and their friends, and released only a few shares in the market, thus creating a scarcity which threatened to snare speculators who had sold shares short in anticipation of buying them back at a lower price. The new railway company was then hyped by friends in the railway press, and its stock bid up by agents in the stock market. Once the shares were trading at a premium, the promoters would offload their retained shares at a vast profit. Some companies even employed special share committees to oversee the success of these operations. Many of the promoters of the new railways appeared interested only in their own personal profit. The same individuals were found on the committees of numerous new railways, in some cases representing rival schemes. Public figures offered their services as committeemen in exchange for shares at a discount. Other committeemen were penniless impostors who fabricated respectability with false titles and positions. Occasionally, the name of a local bigwig was included among the published lists of directors, without his knowledge or permission. Although committeemen were liable in law for the debts of their companies, many discreetly failed to sign the deeds, and thus avoided liability. "If one black sheep can taint a whole flock," proclaimed an editorial in the Times, "there is scarcely one of the speculative lines that does not contain the element of contamination among the number of its provisional committeemen." Naturally, the railway journals were enthusiastic and uncritical supporters of the railway schemes. They puffed dubious new railways in their editorial pages, and received in return some of the hundreds of thousands of pounds spent weekly on advertising the prospectuses. "Such has been the mania for railway advertising," declared the Times, "that papers have been started which were never intended to be sold or read, but only to catch some of the money that was daily being thrown away in preliminary announcements and prospectuses." The most reprehensible creature of the railway mania, concluded the paper, was the stag of the press. The government remained impassive in the face of the growing public involvement in new railway schemes. In April, Alexander Baring, by now Lord Ashburton, declared in the House of Lords that nothing more important could occupy the attention of Parliament than the present feverish state of gambling events connected with railways. In this case, as in many others, it was easier to point out the difficulty than to suggest the remedy. Some argued that the government should control speculation by outlawing the trade in railway scrip before the companies had received their parliamentary bills. But the government ignored this advice and allowed railway companies unhindered access to the legislature. By the close of the first session of Parliament in August, over 100 railway acts had been passed, authorising the construction of around 3,000 miles of railway track. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, embroiled in arguments within his party over the repeal of the Corn Laws, showed no initial anxiety about the potential dangers arising from the mania, and stuck to his laissez-faire position. The previous year, Peel had secured the passing of the Bank Act, which prevented the Bank of England from increasing its note issue above a specified limit. Its aim had been to end the periodic sequence of boom and bust by preventing the explosion of credit during a cyclical upturn. In the early summer of 1845, Peel expressed his satisfaction that the Bank Act had prevented all undue speculation. By late August, however, the Prime Minister was more concerned, writing to Henry Goulburn, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, "Direct interference on our part with the mania of railway speculation seems impracticable. The only question is whether public attention might not be called to the impending danger through the public press." Peel was reluctant to go further than soliciting an unofficial warning, and deferred to the Bank of England's opinion that raising interest rates in order to dampen railway speculation would only produce a panic. This policy was supported by The Economist, which argued that the mania would not be checked by a small rate rise. It would be the greatest folly of the bank directors to disturb their otherwise legitimate routine of business for any such vain hope as deterring or checking such a mania. The only positive action of the government was to disband the ineffective railway department in early July. In the first half of the year, the decisions of the department on new schemes had been eagerly anticipated, and fluctuations in share prices prior to the publication of official notices suggested that insider trading was prevalent. After the dissolution of the railway department, the plans for new railways were laid directly before select committees of the Commons for consideration. So many members of Parliament, however, were committee men or railway shareholders that Lord Salisbury complained it was impossible to find sufficient disinterested parties to examine the new schemes. One railway company boasted of commanding 100 votes in the Commons, and members of Parliament were said to go from one railway office to another, hawking their votes in support of fresh railway bills. The mania was particularly strong in the provinces. This reflected the extension of the railway network away from the metropolitan centres. London had long been connected by rail with the other major trading and manufacturing towns, and failed to share in the railway euphoria. In his journal, the poet Wordsworth observed the spread of the railway mania north of the border. "From Edinburgh to Inverness, the whole people are mad about railways. The country is an asylum of railway lunatics. The Inverness patients, not content with a railway to their hospital from Aberdeen, insist on having one by the Highland Road from Perth. They admit that there are no towns or villages, no population, and no chance of many passengers. But then they will dispatch such flocks of sheep, and such droves of knout." Northern speculation was facilitated by the establishment of exchange banks, which provided loans against the collateral of railway shares. In Glasgow, Edinburgh, Bristol, Birmingham, and a number of smaller towns, new stock exchanges were established for the trade in railway shares. Leeds had 3 competing exchanges, where 500,000 transactions were processed daily by some 3,000 stockbrokers. In late July, the Leeds Mercury described the intensity of the market. "Never was anything like the amount of business done in this town. The streets, which are blessed with the presence of our 3 stock exchanges, resembled a fair on the mornings of those days. Crowds of anxious brokers and speculators thronged them, and the rushing to and fro of brokers, eager to save the precious moments, was worthy of the promoters of rapid locomotion. In neighbouring Wakefield, 9 stockbrokers plied their trade, and 2 express trains travelled twice daily to Leeds, bringing back information on the latest movement in share prices. The Railway Stags. A parliamentary report published in June 1845 revealed the identity of 20,000 speculators who had each subscribed for more than £2,000 worth of railway shares. Heading the list was a Francis Mills of New Street, Spring Gardens, with commitments of over £670,000. Hudson's name appeared in 11th place, with subscriptions of just under £320,000. Alongside the names of 157 members of Parliament, one of whom had signed for £157,000, and 257 clergymen, appeared 40 Browns and 28 Jones and 2.5 pages of Smiths. Observing the broad social base of the railway speculators, the Times announced, "We are a nation of plethoric capitalists." Naturally, many of those whose names appeared on the list had contracted obligations beyond their means. 2 brothers, who together subscribed for £37,500 worth of shares, were discovered to be the sons of a charwoman living in a garret off £1 a week. Such people had no intention of meeting the subsequent calls on railway shares. They signed the subscription documents in the hope of selling scrip at a premium in the market, an act of dubious legality, since full transferability of shares came only after a company had received its parliamentary bill. Known as railway stags, they joined a burgeoning stock market menagerie. Bulls and bears and lame ducks, reported the British and Foreign Railway Review, have long flourished there, but of late a whole herd of stags have invaded the place, of whom there exists at this moment an extraordinary amount of somewhat indefinite terror. The stag, in a state of nature, is a harmless, timid, graminivorous animal, whose appetite is small and easily satisfied, whereas there is no end to the voracity of the carnivorous railway stag, who is always in search of these premiums which constitute the very flesh and blood of railway speculators. The railway stag has only one characteristic in common with his antlered namesake. He is very shy of being seen, and the most experienced hunters find great difficulty in tracing him to his lair. He is, in fact, more cunning than a fox, by which cognomen he would have been more appropriately designated. In the first half of the year, all the new railway schemes yielded profits, or premiums, for the stags, even those projected to uninhabited wildernesses, and those whose bills had been rejected by Parliament. The Economist denounced the irrationality of this situation. The market value of railway scrip depends not on the opinion as to the ultimate success of the undertaking, but rather how far circumstances will tend to sustain or increase the public appetite for speculation. Nothing can show this more powerfully than the fact that we see 9 or 10 proposals for nearly the same line, all at a premium, when it is well known that only one can succeed, and that all the rest must, in all probability, be minus their expenses. A letter in the Times stressed the cynicism of the speculators. There is not a single dabbler in scrip who does not steadfastly believe, first, that a crash sooner or later is inevitable, and secondly, that he himself will escape it. When the luck turns, and the crack play is sauve qui peut, or devil take the hindmost, no one fancies that the last mail train from Panic Station will leave him behind. In this, as in other respects, men deem all men mortal but themselves. In an editorial, the Times itself suggested that the speculators were more naive than cynical. It is only the play of children, trying to lift up one another in the air at the same time. It is the simpler part of the public which is deceived. All commentators agreed none of the speculators was interested in the long-term future of the railways. To a man, wrote the Times, all live upon the present moment, or look at most but a fortnight before them, from one settling day to another. Although both the Times and The Economist, which published a permanent 16-page supplement entitled The Railway Monitor in early October, accepted railway advertisements, neither was swayed from its duty to inform the public of the corruption of the mania and the inevitability of a crash. Never before had foreboding of a crisis been more strongly and frequently articulated by the leading journals of the land. In particular, the newspapers attempted to draw the public's attention to the insupportable amount of capital that was required to finance the reckless extension of the railway system. By June 1845, plans for over 8,000 miles of new railway, 4 times the size of the existing railway system and nearly 20 times the length of England, were under consideration by the Board of Trade. In the following month, new schemes appeared at the rate of over a dozen a week. In a supplement published in early November, entitled The Railway Interest of the United Kingdom, the Times provided a definitive picture of the current state of railway speculation and the unbearable demands it was making on the country's economy. To the end of October, the paper reported, over 1,200 railways were being projected at an estimated cost of over £560 million. The total amount of outstanding railway liabilities was nearly £600 million. This figure exceeded the national income, estimated at around £550 million, of which perhaps £20 million a year could be spent safely on the railways, without starving the rest of the economy of capital. Where, asked the newspapers, was the capital required for railways to come from? They answered that it could only come from a forced conversion of the nation's floating capital, that is, the capital used to support the normal operations of business, into the temporarily unremunerative fixed capital of uncompleted railways, which for the time, observed the Globe, is as much sunk as if it were expended in an attempt to drain the ocean. It is palpably possible, even for such a country as this, to sink too much in this manner within a given time. A pamphlet published in Manchester during the summer warned of an impending crisis, as money was drawn from the legitimate channels of commerce by tradesmen expending their capital on railway calls. Once again the old cry was raised that speculation was distracting people from their lawful occupations. The Economist feared that the real consequences of railway speculation would not be felt immediately, but in later years when construction was underway, and railway calls would consume the nation's capital resources. To think or dream that the present mania will subsist without a crisis the most severe ever experienced in this country, wrote the paper in the middle of August, would be to shut our eyes to all past experience. Throughout the hectic summer months, Hudson was at the height of his glory. Although he disapproved of the reckless extension of the railway system, which threatened the profitability of his own lines, new schemes, rumoured to be connected with the Railway King, attracted a ready premium in the stock market. In fact, Hudson was involved with only one new scheme during this period. When he became chairman of the failing Eastern Counties Railway in the summer of 1845, its shares soared. Hudson retained the highest public profile in the railway world. In the journals of the day, men read of Hudson's wonderful doings, recalled John Francis in his History of the Railways, 1850. The press recorded his whereabouts, the draftsman pencilled his features. He wielded an influence in England unparalleled and unprecedented. Peers flattered the dispenser of scrip, and peeresses fawned on the allotter of premiums. As long as the mania continued, Hudson remained a hero to the people. The former linen draper, who had literally gone from rags to riches, became a living symbol of the get-rich-quick mentality that enthralled the nation. He celebrated his success at the Sunderland election in August by purchasing a 12,000-acre estate from the Duke of Devonshire for nearly £500,000. For his London residence, he acquired the 5-storey Albert Gate mansion in South Kensington, one of the largest private houses in the capital, for £15,000, and spent an equal amount on decorating it. Shareholders at one of his railway companies proposed building a statue of the portly Hudson as a public testimonial to his achievements. £20,000 were soon raised. Among the subscribers were Emily and Anne Bronte, who had invested in the York and North Midland back in 1842 and contributed a grateful £1 from their paper profits, against the wishes of Charlotte, who, expecting the bubble would soon burst, advised her sisters to sell their shares. By late summer, speculation was reaching a climax. Certain railway scrip showed a 500% profit, and interests on loans against railway stock was being charged at rates of up to 80%. Direct routes between towns served only by branch lines became the craze. Foreign railways were projected around the globe, from British Guiana to Bengal. Over 100 railways were planned for Ireland. A railway club was established in the West End, where gentlemen of all ranks connected with railway projects may daily meet for the interchange of information. In September, over 450 new schemes were registered, and a single issue of the Railway Times contained over 80 pages of prospectus advertisements. In just 10 days in early October, over 40 new schemes with a capital requirement of £50 million were announced. Overshadowed by the euphoria was growing evidence of the corruption and fraud begot by the mania. According to a contemporary financial journalist, all rule and order are upset by the general epidemic of speculation, as in the plague of London, when all ties of blood, honour, or friendship were cast away. At the Board of Ordnance, which inspected new railway schemes, 2 members were forced to resign after they were discovered to have speculated in scrip. In August, share deals were repudiated at Leeds, after it was revealed that the number of shares sold in one recently amalgamated company was 10 times greater than had actually been issued. Forged scrip for several companies was in circulation, including the Kentish Coast Railway, whose shares continued to trade at a premium despite the fact that its proposed scheme had been rejected by the Board of Trade and the directors had voted to wind up the company. As construction got underway, railway companies raised funds by calling some of the remaining capital on their shares. By early October, shares were sliding as speculators were forced to reduce their shareholdings in order to meet the costs of railway calls. The Times reported that early on the morning of Tuesday, the 14th of October, a Mr. Elliot of Bayswater had shot himself in Hyde Park. A search of the dead man's pockets revealed papers connected with a number of railways throughout the country. 2 days after this tragic episode, the directors of the Bank of England, worried by a slight decline in their reserves, decided to raise interest rates by 0.5% to 3%. Although the rise was small, it signalled the end of the railway fiesta. In the stock market, there was talk of a railway avalanche as the premiums on scrip evaporated. From London, the bad news travelled rapidly by rail to the provincial exchanges, bringing paralysis to these markets. The transition, declared the Newcastle Journal, has been from unexampled buoyancy to almost hopeless depression, from an unnatural and unstable elevation to the lowest depths of suspicion and distrust. In the general revulsion, even the market for the established dividend-paying railways dried up. By the end of October, Great Western shares were down 40% from their August peak. "A mighty bubble of wealth is blown before our eyes," announced the Times with a certain satisfaction. "As empty, as transient, as contradictory to the laws of solid material, as confuted by every circumstance of actual condition, as any other bubble which man or child ever blew before." A runaway train. Although the period of intense activity in the provincial stock markets was over, the railway mania had set in motion events that were to lead directly to the great financial crisis of 1847. After the crash, provisional committeemen found their interests diverged from those of the shareholders. If a railway project was aborted without a public subscription, the committeemen were legally responsible for all its costs. As a result, when speculators attempted to withdraw their applications for shares, they were refused by the committeemen, and held to their contractual obligation to pay the subsequent share calls. Earlier in the year, when premiums were high, speculators had obtained only a small fraction of the shares they applied for, but after the panic, when scrip was at a discount, they received a full allocation of shares and were ordered to pay up sharply. "The lust of gain which animated all speculators," reported the Glasgow National Advertiser, "is now changing into the cruelty of a reign of terror and the ferocity of a revenge. The world of speculation is transforming into a world of litigation." The growth of litigation led the government to pass an Act in May 1846, enabling the dissolution of railway companies with the assent of 3/4 of the shareholders. The Direct Western, which in January 1845 had received nearly 1.5 million applications for 120,000 shares, became the first company to put an end to itself under the new law. By July 1846, 8 companies had already advertised dissolution meetings under the Act. Despite the Dissolution Act and declining share prices, railway activity continued at a frenetic pace. During the course of 1846, there were over 100 mergers of railway companies, and 270 parliamentary railway acts were passed, authorising the building of nearly 5,000 miles of railway with a capital requirement of over £130 million, more than double the number of acts and 2,000 more miles of railway than had been authorised in the previous year. This has led some commentators to suggest that the mania continued past the October panic of 1845. In fact, most of the railway companies which received their bills in 1846 had been launched the previous year. The most important of them, the Great Northern, was first proposed in early 1844, and the majority of the railway bills were for branch extensions of established concerns that were expanding rapidly in order to fend off competition from the new railways. In 3 hectic days in May, Hudson secured permission from shareholders in 3 of his railway companies to apply for 40 bills, involving an expenditure of over £10 million. The inevitable consequence of this continuing railway activity was to build up even further the burden of railway calls, which exceeded £40 million in 1846. As construction got underway, money was diverted from the normal channels of business to pay for land, iron, timber, and above all, labour. In July 1846, a parliamentary committee reported that around 200,000 men, mostly of Irish origin, would be employed in railway construction for several years to come. The railway labourers were named navvies, after the navigators who had built the canals in the previous century. These costs had to be shouldered by railway speculators, who were forced to reduce their employment of domestic servants, consumption of wine, and sporting activities in order to meet their ongoing railway calls. After a harvest failure in the summer of 1846, economic conditions deteriorated. The rapid switch to railway transport, which allowed for smaller inventories to be kept by businesses and caused a one-time reduction in demand, worsened the situation. The Economist blamed the unsettled climate on the enormous private losses which the wild speculations of the autumn of 1845 have entailed upon the community. In October 1846, Thomas Carlyle, the historian, observed that railway scrip had declined by more than £60 million in value over the past year, and that the losses of the inhabitants of Exeter alone were estimated at more than £8 million. The schedules of the bankruptcy courts were filled with accounts of losses by railway shares. "It is the conviction of those who are best informed," wrote John Francis a few years later, "that no other panic was ever so fatal to the middle class. It reached every hearth, it saddened every heart in the metropolis. Entire families were ruined. There was scarcely an important town in England but what beheld some wretched suicide. Daughters, delicately nurtured, went out to seek their bread. Sons were recalled from academies. Households were separated. Homes were desecrated by the emissaries of the law. There was a disruption of every social tie. The debtors' jails were peopled with promoters. Whitecross Street was filled with speculators, and the Queen's Bench was full to overflowing. In January 1847, the Bank of England raised interest rates to 4% after a decline in its reserves. Throughout the early part of the year, railway calls continued to average around £5 million a month. In early summer, wheat prices fell sharply after early signs of an abundant harvest. This was followed in August by the failure of 13 corn merchants, including the firm of W.R. Robinson, the governor of the Bank of England. Nearly 40 leading mercantile houses failed the following month. Disraeli later recalled a commercial distress of unprecedented severity. Private credit was paralysed, trade was more than dull, it was almost dead, and there was scarcely a private individual in this kingdom, from the richest and noblest in the land down to the most humble among the middle classes, who was not smarting under the circumstances of commercial distress. By early October 1847, dangerously low levels of bullion led the Bank of England to announce it would no longer make advances on public securities. On Monday the 17th of October, the Week of Terror commenced in the city. Consols fell sharply as everyone sought safety in gold. On Tuesday, the Royal Bank of Liverpool failed, followed shortly after by 3 other joint stock banks. Everyone seemed afraid of his neighbour, remembered George Norman at the Bank of England. The Stock Exchange was in a tumult, creditors were distressed, and the best short bills changed hands at 10%. By the end of the week, the Bank of England held less than £500,000 of gold and £1.5 million of notes in its reserves. Any further run, and the bank would be forced to close its doors. On Saturday, the 23rd of October, a deputation of leading city bankers went to Downing Street for a meeting with Lord John Russell, the Prime Minister, and Sir Charles Wood, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They requested a suspension of the Bank Act. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the Bank of England from Downing Street authorising the bank to ignore the terms of the Bank Act and continue its discounting operations. Only 3 years earlier, the Act had been passed with the promise that it would put an end to speculative excesses and financial crises by making them too painful to endure. Now it was suspended in order to save Britain from economic collapse. The suspension brought the financial crisis to an end. In the ensuing debate on the causes of the crisis, contemporary commentators were unanimous. Although Lord Overston blamed the Bank of England for decreasing its reserves in the face of a continuing drain of bullion, he thought the deeper cause of the crisis was want of capital, caused by the extraordinary diversion of capital from trading purposes to the construction of railways. Likewise, Lord Ashburton blamed the bank for mismanagement, but attributed the crisis to the extravagant circulation of railroad paper, by which much of our present difficulties has been caused. The Economist also ascribed the economic crisis to excessive railway expenditure that had consumed the credit available to normal trade and forced up the rate of interest from 2.5% in 1845 to around 10% in October 1847. It had taken nearly 2 years for the full impact of the reckless railway speculations to be felt in the economy at large. Dethroning the Railway King. The final act of the railway mania was still to come. During the revolutionary year of 1848, Hudson became markedly less sanguine about railway prospects. He was frequently observed drunk in the House of Commons, and lost his temper when another member suggested he join a temperance society. In August 1848, a pamphlet appeared entitled The Bubble of the Age, or The Fallacies of Railway Investments, whose author, one Arthur Smith, accused railway directors of manipulating their accounts and paying dividends out of capital. 2 of Hudson's companies, the York and North Midland and the Eastern Counties, were specifically mentioned. Smith also attacked the practice, pioneered by Hudson, of leasing railway lines with the promise of dividends of more than 50% on paid-up capital, which had inflated share prices and encouraged insider trading by directors. Shortly after the publication of Smith's pamphlet, railway share prices went into sharp decline. Despite an increase in passenger traffic, lower fares and more lines had brought a decline in average receipts per mile of track from £3,500 in 1845 to £2,500 in 1848. As a result, dividends were cut on all the major lines. By August 1848, it was estimated that the total decline in railway stocks was £230 million, a figure equivalent to almost half the national income. The share price of the York and North Midland had fallen 2/3 from its 1845 peak, and was trading at a discount to its paid-up capital. The Great Western, whose price had risen to 236 during the railway mania, was also trading below par at 65. The railways had lost their appeal. It was time to dethrone the railway king. Long before Arthur Smith accused railway directors of false accounting, there had been private suspicions that Hudson's business practices lacked probity. In August 1845, Richard Cobden, the free trade activist and Member of Parliament, had remarked on Hudson's undetectable corruption. While Hudson's activities remained outwardly successful, such criticisms were muted, but as the dividends of his companies were cut and their shares fell to a discount, the attacks became more open. In the first few months of 1849, Hudson's rule over the railway world came to an abrupt end. At a shareholders' meeting in February, Hudson was accused of profiting from the sale of shares in one of his companies to another, of which he was chairman, at above market prices. Shortly after, he failed to attend a meeting of shareholders of the eastern counties. "A day of reckoning will come," crowed the Yorkshireman, a long-time enemy of Hudson, "when peculation and jobbing and grave injustice will meet with retributive punishment." In April 1849, a committee investigating Hudson's management of the eastern counties concluded that Hudson had exaggerated revenues and paid over £200,000 of dividends out of capital. A similar inquiry at the York and North Midland found he had paid out £800,000 from capital. On the 8th of May, Richard Nicholson, Hudson's brother-in-law and fellow railway director, committed suicide by leaping into the River Ouse in York, only yards away from the railway station which Hudson had built. During the following months, a variety of accusations dogged Hudson. Insider trading before takeovers, personally profiting from the sale of iron to one of his companies, holding back funds which had been allocated for land purchases, secretly issuing shares to himself and selling them in the market at a premium, and managing a secret service fund to bribe Parliament. It was even said that Hudson had purloined the money raised from the public for his testimonial and used it to purchase his London mansion. In total, Hudson was estimated to have embezzled just under £600,000, excluding the payments made to all shareholders of dividends from capital. In his defence, Hudson claimed that his private affairs and those of his companies had become unfortunately intertwined. On several occasions he had offered personal surety for the liabilities of his railway companies. The practice of charging certain expenses to the capital account was common at the time, and had been accepted when the railways were successful. The Times maintained that the fault did not lie with Hudson alone. The system is to blame. It was a system without rule, without order, without even a definite morality. Yet Hudson had taken advantage of the absence of regulation, acting in secrecy, bullying fellow directors to bow to his will, and opposing any outside supervision of the accounts or any general regulation of the railways. His false accounting and generous dividends had misled spectators into believing that the railways were more profitable than they actually were. Several contemporaries felt that Hudson was simply a scapegoat for the failed speculations. According to Richard Monckton Milnes, the Tory politician, the railway mania had been mere gambling, and the shareholders, having lost, are now kicking over the table and knocking down the croupier. For Carlyle, however, The failure of the speculations and the fall of Hudson represented the restoration of a divine order. "What a world this ever is," he wrote in his journal in May 1849, "full of nemesis, rule by the supernal, rebelled in by the infernal, with prophetic tragedies of old." The historian had long been incensed by the Hudson testimonial. In an essay on Hudson's statue, published in the summer of 1850, he imagined Hudson as a scapegoat swinging from a gibbet, as a tragic pendulum admonitory to the earth in the name of heaven, not some insignificant, abject, necessitous outcast, who had violently, in his extreme misery and darkness, stolen a leg of mutton, but veritably the supreme scoundrel of the Commonwealth, who, in his insatiable greed and bottomless atrocity, had long, hoodwinking the poor world, gone himself and led multitudes to go in the ways of gilded human baseness, seeking temporary profit, scrip, first-class claret, social honour, and the like small ware, where only eternal loss was possible, and who now, stripped of his gildings and cunningly devised speciosities, swung there, an ignominious detected scoundrel, testifying aloud to all the earth, "Be not scoundrels, not even gilt scoundrels, any one of you, for God, and not the devil, is verily king, and this is where it ends, if even this be the end of it." Although Hudson was never charged with criminal wrongdoing, his exposure revealed to all the general corruption engendered by the railway mania. When a manager at the Hudson-controlled York Union Bank was discovered to have stolen and subsequently lost £20,000 in railway speculations, the Yorkshireman declared that Hudson was not only corrupt in himself, but corrupted everyone around him. 7 years later, in February 1856, the poisoned corpse of John Sadler was discovered on Hampstead Heath. Sadler, a former Irish MP, banker and railway promoter, had issued forged shares with a nominal value of £150,000 in the Royal Swedish Railway, of which he was chairman, and had misappropriated £400,000 from an Irish bank. These frauds had been perpetrated in order to cover his stock market losses. Dickens drew on the histories of Hudson and Sadler for his portrait of the swindling banker Merdle in Little Dorrit. Dickens' epitaph for Merdle, who, like Sadler, commits suicide after his exposure, is an astute analysis of the relationship between the corrupt financier and the public during times of speculative euphoria. The next man who has as large a capacity for swindling will succeed as well. Pardon me, but I think you have really no idea how the human bees will swarm to the beating of any old tin kettle. In that fact lies the whole manual of governing them. When they can be got to believe that the kettle is made of precious metals, in that power lies the whole power of men like our late lamented. Once the talisman of the mania, Hudson became its longest-suffering victim. Having paid back the money taken from his companies, he spent much of his time on the continent to escape his creditors. He lost his parliamentary seat in 1859 and was arrested for debt 6 years later. When he died in the winter of 1871, he left an estate, once estimated in millions, of only £200. The road ahead. Railway legislation during the mania had been a wild scramble, with no directing principle. A pamphlet, published in 1847, regretted the grand error of abandoning a national work to what is called private enterprise, but which, as matters turned out, should be rather termed individual caprice and cupidity. Had the state, fortunately, taken up the work itself ab initio, it would not only have been executed more conveniently and economically for the country, but a vast revenue must have accrued to the nation at large. Other countries had taken steps to avoid the dangers of uncontrolled railway speculation. When a railway mania had suddenly appeared in Prussia in early 1844, the government reacted quickly by condemning speculation, banning the sale of options and settlements for differences, or futures, and refusing to sanction new lines. In France, military engineers decided on railway routes before construction was put out to tender by private companies. The most extreme example of government intervention was provided by the Belgian state, which undertook responsibility for the construction and management of the nation's railway system. In Britain, on the other hand, the spirit of laissez-faire dictated that the development of the railways should be left entirely to private enterprise. The uncontrolled expansion of the railway system, in the hands of semi-criminal entrepreneurs, produced a haphazard network. For instance, by the 1850s there were 3 independent routes from Liverpool to Leeds, and 3 alternative routes from London to Peterborough. In many cases, the optimal lines had not been chosen. "We now have to pay for the waste of capital in fruitless parliamentary contests, uneconomic branch lines, and futile competition," wrote the railway historian T.H. Lewin in the 1930s. By January 1850, railway shares had declined from their peak by an average of over 85%, and the total value of all railway shares was less than half the capital expended on them. Owing to over-construction of railroads and increased competition, the average receipts per mile of rail track were a third less than those before the mania. Railway dividends averaged less than 2% of capital expended. Even 5 years later, more than a quarter of the rail companies could not afford to pay dividends, and the great majority paid less than 5%. Many railroads built in the 1840s produced only poor returns, until they were eventually killed off by the arrival of the automobile. The results of the mania, however, were not entirely negative. With over 8,000 miles of track in operation by 1855, Britain possessed the highest density of railways in the world, 7 times greater than that of France or Germany. This brought great benefits to the Victorian economy in terms of faster and cheaper transportation for passengers, raw materials, and finished goods. During the period of construction in the late 1840s, over 500,000 people, a figure equal to those employed in British factories, were dependent on the railways for employment at a time when the country was experiencing a severe economic crisis, albeit one induced by the mania. Tens of thousands of Irish navvies were provided with work throughout the famine years. Viewed from this perspective, the railway mania represented a transfer of income from middle-class speculators to needy labourers, while simultaneously providing the country with the infrastructure for a modern industrial economy. Although the advent of the automobile produced great excitement among British speculators in the 1890s and their American counterparts in the 1920s, the closest parallel to the railway mania is provided by the more recent expansion of the Internet in the mid-1990s. The changes to be wrought by the latest information revolution were described in language strikingly similar to descriptions of the railway revolution of the 1840s. In 1995, Nicholas Negroponte, an American academic and author of Being Digital, claimed that digital living would reduce man's dependence on time and place, close the generation gap, and contribute to world unification. In The Road Ahead, Microsoft chief Bill Gates wrote that the information superhighway will change our culture as dramatically as Gutenberg's press did the Middle Ages. Another proselytizer of the information revolution, George Gilder, described the Internet emerging as the central nervous system of capitalism. By early 1996, America was consumed with a craze for Internet books, Internet films, Internet exhibitions, and even children's Internet swap cards. Just as the railway mania stimulated the growth of a specialist press, so the Internet spawned dozens of national magazines, some of which specialized in Internet investment. Unlike the railways, new Internet companies required little capital investment. Their speculative potential was first realized in the summer of 1995, after the successful flotation of Netscape Communications, an Internet software company. By the spring of 1996, new Internet stocks were flooding the US stock market. In April, 3 providers of Internet browser services were floated on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. The most successful of these, Yahoo, a company founded a year earlier, which boasted meager quarterly sales of $1 million, soared to a 153% premium on its first day, the third greatest rise in history, giving it a market capitalization of $850 million. When Zenith, a loss-making television manufacturer, announced in early May that it would begin producing televisions with Internet connections, its shares rose threefold. "Breathe the word Internet around a stock," announced an analyst, "and anything can happen." Whereas in the 1840s the speculative fervour was sustained by the crowds around the provincial exchanges, a century and a half later it was nourished on the Internet itself. Discount brokerages thrived by offering cheap Internet share-dealing services, and online investment forums, such as the Waco Kid Hot Stocks Forum and the Motley Fool, became some of the most popular destinations on the Internet. Just as the railway boom spawned new stock exchanges, the Internet itself became a stock market, enabling companies to float their shares in cyberspace. The medium was no longer just the message. It was both the source and object of speculation. "Gold rushes," wrote Bill Gates in a prophetic conclusion to his book, "tend to encourage impetuous investments. A few will pay off, but when the frenzy is behind us, we will look back incredulously at the wreckage of failed ventures and wonder, who funded those companies? What was going on in their minds? Was that just mania at work?"
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook. So please check your library for the next part of this audiobook.